President Trump hit the campaign trail in New Hampshire Friday, one day after formally accepting his party's renomination for president. During his acceptance speech, Mr. Trump focused on issues of, quote, law and order. He warned Americans their communities will not be safe if Joe Biden is elected. Near the White House complex, the president's speech was met by a crowd of protesters who made noise and shot off fireworks. The demonstrations continued Friday with a march on Washington, exactly 57 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. Crowds gathered in the nation's capital to protest against racial injustice. CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang has the latest.
President Trump is stumping in New Hampshire tonight, where he trails Joe Biden by a significant margin. In Washington, as social justice protesters marched just blocks from the White House, the president called reporters to the Oval Office to witness his pardon of Alice Johnson, whose life sentence he had commuted 2 years ago after lobbying from Kim Kardashian. He ignored questions about the protesters outside. Meanwhile, his campaign said today that 4 people who were part of the Republican convention events in North Carolina on Monday had tested positive for COVID-19. It was a striking display last night as nearly 2,000 audience members did not socially distance and largely were not wearing masks. The president did not mention the coronavirus until 30 minutes into his speech.
And will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner.
Mr. Trump condemned looters and rioters and said only he could ensure law and order.
My administration will always stand with the men and women of law enforcement.
The president warned in dire terms that the country would suffer under a Biden presidency.
Joe Biden is not a savior of America's soul. He is the destroyer of America's jobs.
Joe Biden criticized President Trump for holding a, quote, super spreader event at the White House here in New Hampshire. The fire department says about 1,400 people are packed into this hangar. The Trump campaign says masks are required as part of a state ordinance, but most people are not wearing one. Elaine?
Weijia Jiang, thank you. Let's bring in Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, and Molly Hooper. Major is CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent. Catherine is CBS News Senior Investigative Correspondent. And Molly is a CBS News Political Contributor. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Major, the president scheduled a campaign event in New Hampshire Friday. Joe Biden says he'll resume campaign travel soon and visit key battleground states. Given the circumstances, how important is it for both campaigns to meet with voters?
Well, let's just take it as a pure political matter, Elaine, and then let's also put it in the context of the pandemic. As a pure political matter, what the president wants to relentlessly show a contrast of is his vigor and his strength dealing with the campaign trail, getting out as actively as possible and relentlessly portraying former Vice President Joe Biden, now the Democratic nominee, as either too weak or too tired to campaign aggressively for the highest office in the land. That's the politics of it. Now, the pandemic creates a different atmosphere. The Biden campaign wants to say we will do everything based on the science and minimizing health risk. But the campaign also knows to counter this impression from President Trump that the former vice president is either weak or sleepy, to use the president's terminology, or just not aggressive enough, not demonstrating the strength that this office requires, they're going to have to do more in-person campaigning. One thing the president has basically accommodated himself to, I've been told by senior officials in the campaign, he knows he can't have big rallies anymore. But he's decided, and he has come to accept, these smaller airport rallies as a place that gets him a crowd, maybe not as large a crowd, definitely not as large a crowd, but large enough to sort of give him that sense of satisfaction. Plus, he can do many of these events in a day once the heat of the campaign builds. And essentially, the campaign has persuaded the president this is the best you can do. It's efficient. It has a rally feel to it. Wrap your arms around it. And I'm told the president psychologically has.
I want to turn to coronavirus relief talks. White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows said Friday the administration is willing to sign a $1.3 trillion coronavirus stimulus package, but he said House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is insisting on $2.2 trillion. So, Molly, what's the situation here? What kind of position are House Democrats in to try to get the relief bill that they want?
Well, it seems right now that there's not a lot of wiggle room between the Democrats, who are again pushing for $2.2 trillion. That's down from the $3.2 trillion that they were earlier insisting on. There's not a lot of wiggle room between that and the $1.3 trillion that the Trump administration seems amenable to. Keep in mind, Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Republican Party on the Senate side, only wants $500 billion. So therein lies the rub. Where are they going to find a compromise? And it looks like, unless something unexpected happens, which these days it seems like it's happening every day, could happen over the next week or so. It looks really like whatever sort of deal they come up with regarding coronavirus relief, it would probably be included in an end-of-year package or a continuing resolution that's tacked on to the government funding bill that would take us, to the end of the year in terms of funding. Because remember, the end of the fiscal year comes on September 30th, and Congress has to fund the government essentially at that date through to the end of the year in order for the government to stay open. So what I'm hearing from my sources on Capitol Hill is that due to the lateness of this month and the fact that Congress is coming back mid-September, we are more likely to see something included in that continuing resolution, that all-encompassing funding bill that would take funding through the end of the year.
Wow, so many Americans looking to Washington for some kind of help. On the pandemic
Elaine,
itself,
can
Major,
I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Major.
So one quick thought, and Molly said something very important there. If something else happens, well, something else has happened. Hurricane Laura has happened, and I was talking to several people in the White House and on the campaign yesterday, and they said, look, this is going to be a serious issue, and there's going to be long-running damage, and people are going to be in need. And we don't want to treat this as if it's just an ordinary kind of hurricane, because it isn't. They foresee this, the Trump campaign and the White House, as their version of Sandy, a huge storm with massive dislocations, and they do not want to suffer any negative comparisons. They don't want to appear either indifferent or not up to the task of dealing with all of the destruction. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. They want to say, look, rural America, we treated this the same way the Obama administration treated Hurricane Sandy, even though that was a coastal storm with lots of media exposure. The Trump campaign and the White House doesn't expect that kind of level of exposure because it's not on the eastern seaboard. And they want to say, we're going to be aggressive about this, and that's going to require money. And that could be an accelerant to these talks because the money is going to have to be put together and put together rapidly to assure all the states affected by this massive storm that they're going to have what they need. That could add both an inducement, an incentive, and a little bit of an accelerant to these talks.
That's an interesting dynamic, and I know, Major, the president is going to be visiting those affected areas this weekend. Back to the pandemic itself, Major, there was very little social distancing and few masks for the president's speech at the White House last night. Several speakers referred to the pandemic in the past tense during the Republican convention. What is the message from the Trump administration and the president's campaign on the pandemic?
Well, it's mixed as ever. The rhetoric is, oh, it's serious and we've done all these wonderful historic things and it's not as bad as it sounds and the media exaggerates things. Well, the public is going to come to its own determination about that. Central fact number one, during this 4-day convention, nearly 4,000 Americans died of COVID-19. That's one backdrop you can't ignore. It's a statistical reality. And colleges, universities, school districts are still struggling with positive cases and the disruptions that those bring. And the economy still has a cloak of uncertainty around it, all related to the pandemic. Now, I have another podcast in addition to The Takeout. It's called The Debrief. And for it last week, I asked this question. Was COVID-19 in America a lost summer? did we lose a lot of ground that we otherwise could have gained? One of the people I talked to was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. He said the most important thing in America right now is the behavior of Americans. What did he mean by that? That they must wear masks. These are his words, not mine. They must social distance, and they must follow rigorous hygiene requirements. Well, last night at the White House, standing before the president, often applauding, neither of the first two things were adhered to: mask wearing or social distancing. Alex Azar, uniquely among cabinet secretaries that I was able to see on television, was wearing a mask. Almost no one else was. So, one of the top voices within this administration says behavior matters most. And the behavior exhibited and tolerated by this White House ran completely counter to that. I think that's all you need to know about the mixed messaging in relationship to behavior, the pandemic, and how to deal with it.
Well, during his speech, President Trump once again accused President Obama of spying on his 2016 campaign. Catherine, help us fact check that. What does the evidence suggest?
Well, this is a very complicated topic, Elaine, and I always go back to the documents. These recently declassified documents by the Director of National Intelligence do show that in the summer of 2016, members of the FBI Crossfire Hurricane team used what's called a defensive briefing. These are briefings designed to warn the candidate about national security threats, to gather information about candidate Trump, his incoming National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, and Governor Chris Christie about their lines of questioning specifically about Russia. So they were gathering intelligence as part of this FBI investigation. And that's okay if the basis of the investigation has very solid evidence and it's on solid footing. And that's really at the heart of the investigation by the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, John Durham. He is looking at whether the case was properly predicated, so there was sound evidence, and whether the FBI followed the standard practices for an investigation of this sensitivity. And we've already had a hint from the U.S. Attorney John Durham as to what his findings have shown. If you sort of dial back in time to the end of last year when the Inspector General Michael E. Horowitz released his report about the 4 surveillance warrants for a Trump campaign aide. And at that time, John Durham took the unusual step of issuing a public statement. And the language, I think, is very important to pay attention to. He said, "We do not agree with some of the report's conclusions," that's the Inspector General's conclusions, "as to the predication and how the FBI case was opened. We don't have more detail as to why Durham had reached that conclusion, and we don't know how he's backing it up. But it gives you a sense of how politically charged this question is of whether it's spying or whether it was the gathering of intelligence for a properly run investigation by the FBI into these contacts between members of the Trump campaign and Russia."
Back on the Republican convention, Molly, as you know, House Democrats are not happy with the staging of some of the Republican convention events at the White House, and they're also not happy with an appearance by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo during the convention from a trip overseas while he was in Jerusalem. How are House Democrats responding?
Well, you're right, Elaine. They are not happy, and they want investigations because under the so-called Hatch Act, and that's a phrase or a term that you might hear over the next few weeks and months leading up to the election. Under the Hatch Act, federal employees, they can have their political opinions and everything. They just can't espouse them at work on government property at the expense of the taxpayers. And you know, this was a unique convention given at a unique time during the coronavirus, but this is the first time the president of the United States has actually held sort of this political rally from the White House. That hasn't been done in the past because largely presidents want to keep the politics out of the policies. And again, you know, if it's for most other federal officials, like Acting Secretary of Homeland Security, Chad Wolf, and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, it's illegal for them to participate in political events on the government's dime. And so Democrats are looking, and Democrats in particular, wrote to the U.S. Special Counsel to say, hey, we need you to investigate Chad Wolf, like I said, acting director of Homeland Security, for initiating this naturalization ceremony in the White House, ostensibly before a political rally and for political purposes. Investigate whether that's what he did, and if he did, take action. And in terms of Mike Pompeo, gave this video, these remarks from Jerusalem, obviously outside the United States. But Democrats on the House Foreign Affairs Committee are actually launching an investigation into whether whether any State Department dollars were spent on the production of that video, because Pompeo made that video when he was on a government trip. So those are the questions. It's unclear whether anything will really happen before the election, but it's bound to be an issue in the next few weeks, leading up to the election, essentially.
Yeah. Well, Major, President Trump and Republicans are, of course, campaigning on law and order while accusing Joe Biden and Democrats of being unable to quell violence and anarchy. Break down this strategy for us, Major. What is the political calculation being made as these scenes of social unrest continue to play out in American cities?
The calculation within the Trump campaign in the White House is as follows, that external events, predominantly protests, and any attendant violence is frightening enough to most Americans that when you draw a bright line of contrast, I'm opposed to that, Joe Biden is either sympathetic to it or allows it to happen, you are creating a dividing line that is a net positive for the Trump campaign and the president's reelection bid. That is the calculus. The question for the country is, and the question for the Trump campaign is, can you keep that line of demarcation, that bright line drawing for the entire course of the campaign, or will there be a reassessment? There are other events that are playing out this week, Elaine, that are giving the White House a bit of pause. Chiefly, prominent athletes saying, you know what? We are in the amusement business, that is true, but we are not only amusing human beings. We are real human beings who have a platform, and we are going to use it. We're going to boycott games. We're going to use this platform beneath us through sports, whether you're in the NBA, whether you're in the Major League Baseball, Major League Soccer, the WNBA, and we're going to take a stand and we're going to say things about this moment our country is in, about the gap between justice and African Americans and Latinos in this country. And when you saw at Ole Miss today, college athletes doing the same, that's another external event. The White House has no control over that. For that matter, neither does the Biden campaign. But how the country responds to this moment and characterizes its own attitude about that will have a lot more to do with the longevity of these two arguments. One thing happened this week that's significant. The Trump campaign looked at former Vice President Biden, who said, I'm opposed to the violence in Kenosha, Wisconsin. They said, he sees bad poll numbers, so he has to condemn the violence. Well, what did Vice President Mike Pence say today on a campaign trip? It's not an either or. You can be sympathetic to law enforcement and hear the cries for justice from our African American brothers. That also tells you the Trump campaign has realized it cannot only operate rhetorically on a pro-law enforcement line and be indifferent to these cries for justice from the African American community. Both parties and both nominees are feeling the pressure of this moment. And you know what? It has almost nothing to do with their tactical insights. It has to do with how the country is responding itself. The voters may prove to be far ahead of both political parties on this. We'll see it play out. We'll find out by November 3rd.
Really interesting to hear that. Switching gears, Catherine, this week, one of the targets of the Russia probe, Carter Page, released a book. He's the former Trump campaign advisor accused of being a back channel to Russia. He was eventually cleared by the special counsel. But Catherine, what were some of your takeaways from his book?
I think one of the most significant headlines in the book, and based on the conversations he had with CBS News, Carter Page maintains that he had a decades-long relationship providing information to the CIA about Russia, China, and the Middle East, and that this relationship, which dates back to the 90s, was a relationship where he was what's called a directed asset. That means that he's not just showing up to the CIA and providing information, that he he incidentally picks up. He's providing information that the CIA has told him, Carter Page, that they're interested in, and they'd like him to go out and investigate. And the reason all of this matters is that once again, it's like all roads lead back to this Durham investigation. When we had a guilty plea from an FBI lawyer in recent weeks, if you dig into the statement of offense, it says that members of the FBI hurricane team, Crossfire Hurricane team, were told by CIA in August, 2 months before the first surveillance warrant was obtained for Carter Page, that he had this relationship with the CIA. And the reason that relationship matters is that it would have gone some way to explain his contacts with Russians, with Chinese officials, with people in the Middle East. And that was important information for the surveillance court to have when they made that very weighty decision to authorize the surveillance of an American citizen inside the United States. So bottom line, Carter Page was someone who had been working for decades to support the U.S. intelligence community. In this particular case, the CIA, and much later, he also worked to support a major FBI criminal investigation involving Russian citizens.
Wow, really fascinating to hear about that background. All right, Major Garrett, Catherine Herridge, and Molly Hooper. It's been a long week, but it is always wonderful
but a
to
fun
end it
week
with you. Thank you very much. Thanks.